I'll have to admit that I was kind of stuck for a topic for this video. I wasn't planning on seeing X-Men Apocalypse, I lost interest around film 3 of this series, and the next movie I plan to see is actually Star Trek Beyond, which is still a month away. By now you've probably seen the series about Ghostbusters over at Midnight's Edge. Even with the distaste for the new Ghostbusters movie, and the recent performances of X-Men and the Turtles movie, there's been something of a backlash lately over Hollywood rebooting certain film franchises. Now, many would be quick to say to me, well, Shlomo, Hollywood has been out of ideas for a while now. But there's actually a bigger picture to consider when it comes to Hollywood rebooting certain films. Even though we see movie revenues in the billions these days, the US movie audience has actually been on the decline and has been for the last 2 decades. Sure, Marvel, Disney, and big franchises like James Bond and The Hunger Games have helped pad the numbers, but the overall audience has been sagging, and in 2014 it hit a 20-year low. One solution has been to try to increase the number of tentpole franchises based on once popular nostalgia properties, which is why we've had reboots of certain popular film franchises lately. Films like Total Recall, Terminator Genisys, and this summer we're getting the long-awaited Independence Day sequel, which is about 20 years too late. But it seems that nostalgia alone isn't enough these days to draw fans into the cinema. Terminator Genisys had a budget of $155 million and only made $89 million in the US, but it did manage to make over $350 million overseas. The 2012 remake of Total Recall had a budget of $125 million and made $58.8 million in the US, but it made $139 million overseas. I want you to keep those second numbers in mind from now on. The 2014 reboot, remake, retread, or whatever you want to call it of RoboCop had a budget of $100 million, and it made $58.6 million in the US and $148 million overseas. Are we starting to see a pattern emerge here? The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had a budget of $255 million and made $202 million in the United States, but made $506 million at the foreign box office. As of recording this, even though it's being said to underperform in the US, X-Men Apocalypse is doing far better overseas than it is here. The only movie that this doesn't apply to is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows, which seems to be a dud everywhere. Are we starting to see the bigger picture here? Studios aren't rebooting these movies because they're out of ideas. It's because that even though we may be sick of them, they still make boatloads of money overseas. Currently, there are over 107 remakes in the works at various studios. These films include things like Ace Ventura, Charlie's Angels, Highlander, and even the more recent Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Even the movie Shaft, which had received a reboot from the previous 70s blaxploitation movie in 2000 starring Samuel L. Jackson, is getting yet another reboot. But rebooting these films doesn't come without certain problems. In 2012, the remake of Red Dawn starring Chris Hemsworth originally had the Chinese invading the United States. Fearing the loss of a staggering amount of money from the Chinese box office, Film District and MGM delayed the film and spent approximately $1 million to remove every reference to China and all Chinese iconography. The villains, instead of China in the final film, were North Korean. Which brings us to another reason for the reboot craze. China has been on track to surpass the United States as the largest film audience and may do so by 2017. But here's the thing, every year the government only allows 34 Western films to be released in China. And if a studio gets one of those coveted 34 spots, what are they going to go with? Not knocking these films, but certainly not something as esoteric and difficult to understand as Brooklyn or The Danish Girl. They're going to go with something that they feel won't be lost in translation. If you've ever wondered why the Fast and the Furious movies are so huge all over the world, it's because Man Drive Car Fast works in any language. Warner Brothers have even teamed up with China Media Capital and Hong Kong broadcaster TVB to produce remakes of Miss Congeniality and blended specifically for the Chinese audience. Because while a reboot or a remake may not be new to you, it's still quote-unquote new to them. Or at the very least, it's something that a foreign audience may have heard of but never have seen. But on some level, those who decry the reboot or the remake do share some of the blame for the current state of cinema. Despite being highly rated and made on a budget of $20 million, the Oscar Isaac film, A Most Violent Year, only made $12 million at the box office. Total. A film like this is often ignored through no fault of its own. Studios release tentpole movies in the summer where they can have the biggest impact, and will hold back films for award consideration just before New Year's, all but guaranteeing that nobody will see them. Now that's not to say that all these are going to be bad, and certainly some things can stand to be updated. Flash Gordon can stand to have a more modern treatment, and I'm curious to see what that would look like with a decent budget and some CGI. And now with audiences used to the idea of an immediate sequel, there's the possibility that something like Frank Herbert's Dune, if it ever gets made, can finally receive a proper film treatment. After attempting to watch it 5 different times, I still can't get through the first half hour. And some things like Batman, James Bond, and Star Trek, and even The Phantom can stand to have a reboot every so often. But the predilection toward reboots is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you're chasing a quick buck overseas, but eventually foreign audiences are going to become sick of them just as we are. While it's much easier for a studio to recycle a script and then cast a human fence post like Jai Courtney, whose appeal I for one still can't seem to explain, eventually those audiences will be asking themselves, how many times are we going to see another insert proven franchise here? Chapter in Russian and/or Mandarin. See you next time.
Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in. My